Okay, I'm going to pick up where I left off last week, Chapter 4 of Summer with the Marine. This one is from Ford's perspective. And for those of you who've been following me along and commenting and everything, it's great. I thank you. So here we go. Chapter 4, Ford. Standing on the upper deck of the house he'd recently inherited, Ford took in the sweeping vista of the bay. It was indeed as blue as the sky. The sun was bright and beamed off the white sand beach in the distance. Just a quick jaunt across Mansion Mile, and he'd have his feet in the water. A small hand tugged on his. Their eyes met. So much blue. He scooped Coco into his arms. His daughter was another anchor in the storm of his life, and yet she'd partly caused it. He sighed, pecked her on the temple, and the two bobbed down the stairs. They crossed the street and waded into the water on the private beach, collected a few seashells, and reapplied sunblock twice. Thank goodness there was a manual for how to take care of a 2-year-old's basic needs. Unfortunately, there wasn't one for how to mend her heart. At least he assumed it was broken. The story of his ex-wife's negligence and her untimely death certainly broke his. It wasn't that he'd still loved Tina or felt any affection for her, but she'd kept him from his daughter and made a series of decisions that were devastating. He'd hired a nanny as they made the adjustment as a family, but Ford wasn't sure what his next steps were. He figured having help would be temporary because he wanted to spend as much time with his daughter as he could, to make up for lost time he could never get back, time that was taken from him. His heart was broken for his daughter, but hardened to his ex. After seeing Eisley, it had started beating faster. With her sudden appearance in his life, he had more to figure out, and nap time was all he had at the moment. His phone beeped in his pocket. He tapped in his password. It was a message from the lawyer. He'd get to it later. When he'd placed the phone in Eisley's hand that evening before, he expected her to declare that she didn't know the password. Then he'd tell her, and maybe that would soften the tension between them. He wanted the gesture to say what he couldn't put into words, that rarely a day passed when he didn't think about her, that he was sorry for ditching her, for hurting her, and for confusing her, that he wanted to be friends again, that he'd never stop being friends with her, at least in his mind, but it was what was in his heart that was the difficult thing he couldn't put into words. Marrying Tina had been a mistake, a rash decision after the war, an attempt to capture what he wanted most, a family, stability, a home to return to. She'd given him a headache, heartache, and a solid need to question his judgment. He thought he was doing the right thing. It turned out his ability to do the right thing had been compromised when he'd left Eisley and never responded to her. He was a God-fearing man, but if there was such a thing as fate, perhaps there was karma too, and Tina leaving him was a payback for ditching Eisley. However, Tina had also given him a daughter who he adored, even though that had been a complete surprise. In a strange way, life had a way of working out when he stopped fighting against it. He tapped Eisley's name in his phone. It rang and rang. Her message was short. "It's Eisley. Leave a message." "Hey, Eis, it's Ford. Not sure if you're working or busy, but I'll be at the beach next to Coconut Cove Cafe in an hour and a half if you'd like to meet up and talk." The words came out of jumble, as though he'd forgotten how to speak properly, or at least speak to her. Perhaps it was so much time spent with a 2-year-old. Ford slathered her on more sunscreen, moving carefully around the scar. It had healed well, but from time to time the bone beneath still felt bruised. He was already tanned from years spent outside doing drills, training, and fighting, but he'd recently seen some old-timers around Blue Bay Beach and took to heeding his doctor's warning about using sunscreen. He was new to listening to others, well, aside from those in command, but he was doing his best and would certainly listen to Eisley because, no doubt, she had a lot to say. Back at the mansion, he and Coco had a snack, some water, and then he settled her in for a nap before the nanny arrived. When she did, he informed her he'd be out for a few hours. The garage of the mansion housed a Jaguar, a Maserati, and a Bentley, all courtesy of his benefactor. He was considering getting a minivan to replace his Jeep, but the beach next to Coconut Cove wasn't far and the town wasn't welcoming of cars, so he went on foot. Plus, the walk would give him a chance to figure out how to explain things to Eisley. Instead of cooperating, his mind crossed out all his ideas and then scribbled over them like a toddler with a crayon. His thoughts repeatedly drew back to Eisley. Big honey brown eyes, bee-stung lips, apple cheekbones that lifted when she smiled. His stomach growled. He stopped at the Coconut Cove Cafe. Eisley wasn't there. She must have had a later shift that day. He ordered a sandwich to go and then plunked himself down in the sand on the beach. The tide was moving in, but the waves were lazy and at odds with how he felt. Jumpy, ready to take action, do something with purpose. It was hard retiring from the military. It had been his life. Now he was adjusting to the new one that had been thrown at him from left field. His counselor's voice threaded through his thoughts, reminding him that his new role as a father held great purpose and that he was in an adjustment period. At the same time, he heard his name. "Hey, Ford, is that you?" It wasn't Eisley, but a woman he'd met when at the market. Being a single father was lady bait, or perhaps it was the sizable house he'd moved into. He'd hooked at least 3 in the last week that he'd been in town. Not that he was interested. Not at all. They chatted for a minute, then a long shadow crossed the sand. "You're here," Ford breathed, accidentally interrupting the woman who was letting him know she'd love to have him over for dinner later that day, and that she was single and that she loved kids. Apparently she made a delicious shrimp salad. In case she hadn't noticed, he'd needed to eat a bit more than a shrimp salad. The woman rocked back on her heels and glanced at Eisley as Ford brushed past. He couldn't hide his smile, directed at Eisley, looking like pure summertime ease, wearing a sundress. She was the person he wanted to hear laugh again. No, he wanted to make her laugh. He wanted to see her smile at something he said or did. She was the person he wanted to be friends with again. "Nice seeing you." He nodded to the woman who'd approached him because he was a gentleman despite his usual gruff manner. The woman tilted her head in a coy smile. "Well, the invitation stands. I'm on Egret Ave." She wiggled her fingers in a wave and sauntered off. Eisley stood there a moment. The light breeze off the water ruffled the hem of her dress. Her legs were long and she dug her toes into the sand. Ford sat back down and patted the spot next to him. "I got you some fries. My mother said I'm too thin and won't stop feeding me. I see you're trying to plump me up too." There was a hint of laughter in her voice. He hoped it was the beginning of forgiveness. "I didn't know Mrs. Higgins was here too. Small world, huh? What are the chances? Let's just hope Mr. Knuckles isn't here or the rest of the block," Ford said. At that, Eisley smiled, just barely holding back laughter. Ford warmed all over. "I forgot about Mr. Knuckmeyer," Eisley said. "Mr. Knuckles, because he always threatened to give us a knuckle sandwich," they said at the same time, around hearty laughter. "Remember Agatha Bruche, Marty Cirillo, and Donna Picardi? They had it in for us." For a moment they reminisced about some of their exploits and adventures in the New Jersey neighborhood they grew up in. "We were little scamps." "They used other names for us," Eisley said in a low voice. "Ones only my brothers would dare repeat." "How are they doing?" Eisley asked. "Sonny's in jail and Alex is a divorced father of 3. "Sorry to hear that. We haven't talked in years." Ford shook his head. The wind picked up, or she winced. He wasn't sure. He had a habit of leaving the past behind. "How about your father?" she asked. "I wish I had better news. He had liver disease and passed a few months ago. I was able to see him once more before—" Eisley's hand landed on his forearm. The connection caused his pulse to double. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." Her soft palm rooted him when all he wanted to do was jump to his feet and pound something, channel his feelings elsewhere. The counselor told him to get a heavy bag and take up meditation. He'd done both, and believe it or not, it helped. The breathing did too. So did Eisley. "Did your dad ever turn up?" he asked. It was a bold question, but one that had come to be a sort of repartee between them after her cat had gone missing. Cosmo returned. Her father didn't, but he supposed it was a way for her to keep the hope alive. "No, but you did. You turned up." Ford nearly fell over in the sand. "I won't lie. I'm upset with you, but I'm willing to listen to what you have to say." She took another French fry. Hope sparked in him as well, then quickly fizzled as the warm salt water reached his toes on an incoming wave. They scooted back away from the tide. He rested his elbows on bent knees. She seemed so small next to him. He wanted to hug her close and protect her from what he knew he needed to share. That's the end of chapter 4. And the way I'm doing this is I'm doing a chapter in a new live, each chapter in a new live. So I'm just going to stop this, save it, and then I'll start right out over again. So if you're watching, thank you. I'm so glad you're here. And just look for my live to come back up. And I'm doing that in case, readers can only listen to one chapter at a time. So make it easier for everybody to kind of go through. So anyway, I will be back in 1 minute. Make sure I do this right. Also, I'm going to wave at you guys. Thank you for joining me.